This relates to what we're talking about today, but I want to start with a fun fact about myself that maybe you knew, maybe you haven't known. I camped out for the release of the original iPhone. Oh yeah. I've always been a huge Apple product fanatic. In fact, they call us Apple sheep on the internet. Someone just came up with that term to describe like the cultish following of some people who just avidly follow Apple products. I am by far an Apple sheep. I've had a Macintosh laptop since I was in the 5th grade. My most frequently visited website after Facebook and Instagram is macrumors.com, which literally just follows Apple news and rumors throughout, all the time. I watch all of the keynote presentations live, and then I watch all the YouTube videos of tech YouTubers reviewing everything from the keynote, and it just repeats. It's bad. It's bad, guys. I always have been, and I continue to be to this day. So naturally, when Apple unveiled the iPhone for the very first time in January of 2007, I and the rest of the world was floored. Never before had such a device hit the market, and I just knew I had to get this thing. So my mom and I took the drive to Muncie, Indiana on June 28th of 2007, and we camped outside an AT&T store to ensure that we would get this thing. And man, we made some dear friends along the way. You just bond with those where you just kind of with just those other people where we slept in our cars, we ate fast food the whole time, it rained, we smelled by the end of it. It was awesome. Granted, we realized later on that we could have just showed up 3 hours before the release and we would have gotten one, so that was a little bit of a bummer, but it was worth it. It's worth it. And I've been an iPhone user ever since. And this device has completely changed the way the world works, hasn't it? It has completely changed the way the world works. We now take it for granted, but back in the 2000s, it felt like magic. How we could just Google up a coffee shop in a city that we've never been before and get turn-by-turn directions. That we can watch movies on our phones without having to put DVDs into this little box to play it on a TV. You remember those things? Right? Or how we could use social media apps to connect with each other in ways we could only do through desktop computers and dial-up internet, Now we can turn our cars on from apps on our phone from wherever we are. We can adjust the temperatures of our house. We can activate a voice assistant to do tasks for us. And I haven't even gotten into the magic of Snapchat filters. Right? It's ridiculous. So I'm just curious, who here has a smartphone? Hold it up. Get it out of your pockets. Let's just hold it up for all of us to see if you have something like this, a device of this sort. Almost all of us. Almost all of us. Can all show off your cases, right? We all have different cases for it, which is funny. You see, it's truly amazing to see all the things that this technology can do for us, but what's not near as amazing is what this technology has done to us. Right? This technology has done a lot of things for us, but the core question is, what is it doing to us? It has opened up a world of possibilities that not only better humanity, but also corrupt it. And in many instances has taken over our well-being for the worst. Because little did we know that on June 29th, 2007, Apple unleashed what would become a demon in our pockets. So that's what we're talking about today. We're in our 5th and final week of a series called Asking for a Friend. This has been a tough series. We've been talking about tough topics over the course of the last 5 weeks, including what does the Bible have to say about being gay, transgenderism, abortion, and politics. These are questions that maybe a lot of you are asking, but you didn't want to necessarily disclose that you're asking them, so we asked them for you. And if you've missed any of those sermons or you want to catch up on them, if you scan the QR code on those Connect cards, it brings you to our link tree where you can find our podcasts on Apple and Spotify, and you can go back and you can listen to those sermons. We've also been doing special Going Deeper episodes with Mason and I, just going deeper into all the questions that we don't even have time to answer here this morning. So this morning, though, we are talking about technology. What does the Bible have to say about technology? And you might be thinking, of all the hard topics we could be talking about, why is this one of them? Aren't there harder things in culture that we really need to figure out? Well, this is one that is so much more subtle than what we think, and it is affecting us in so many more ways than we think. In fact, I would attribute a lot of the tensions we have with the last 4 weeks' worth of topics is only proliferated by these things. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but before we do, one thing, like this little challenge we've been doing at the beginning of every single sermon is kind of paying homage back to what Jesus did in John chapter 8 when the religious leaders brought out this adulterous woman. She was caught in the act. They were getting ready to stone her, to put her to death, right, by breaking the law of Moses, by committing adultery outside of the context of marriage. And Jesus said, okay, but if you're without sin, you can cast the first stone. And they all walked away, and Jesus just comes up to her and says, I don't condemn you, so go and sin no more. And so in a similar act, we've been like grabbing these stones and dropping them in buckets to kind of symbolize our way of submitting ourselves to what God has to say, while also laying down perhaps the stones that we have, our positions, our comments that we want to throw at other people because they are differentiating from us. We don't have stones on your chairs this morning because I don't think it's necessarily, like we can certainly use these things to harm others, right? But I think more so these are the things that are harming us. These are the stones that are being thrown towards us in so many more ways. And so, instead of, I actually thought about, like, let's just have everyone get their smartphones and just come up here and lay them on the altar. Just have a bunch of phones up here that you'll never be able to find again. And then we come up and we smash all of, no, just kidding, we wouldn't do that. But at the very least, just as some physical, symbolic act that we're going to lay down our stones and just to see what God might have to say to them, I just want you to take your phone out and just put it under your chair. Out of sight, out of mind, turn it on Do Not Disturb even. Heck, turn it off if you want to. Just as a way for us to say, God, teach us something with this. We submit this to you. So what does the Bible have to say about our technology use? Well, unfortunately, we'll be hard-pressed to find any passage of Scripture that tells us how to utilize our screen time or how to, shut off all of these apps and notifications and all of those things. It has nothing to say about that. But what it does have to say is regarding the use of idols. And that is more closely connected to our modern use of technology than we think. So we're going to start in the book of Exodus, specifically Exodus chapter 20. If you want a Bible and you want to, or if you have a Bible and you want to read along, turn to Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. In the book of Exodus, after God frees his people from slavery from the Egyptians, God takes Moses up to the top of a mountain and he gives him all these commands and laws for how his people were to conduct themselves as a nation, but also as people submitting themselves in worship to God. And so in Exodus 20, God gives Moses one of the most important sets of scripture we have, the 10 Commandments. These 10 Commandments have been highly regarded as just a really simple framework for morality and how to navigate any moral issue, like don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't murder, honor your father and mother, and so many others. But I want to specifically hone in on the first two commands that God gives in Exodus 20, verses 1 through 6. Here's what it says. Then God gave the people all these instructions. I am the Lord your God, who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. Commandment number 1. You must not have any other God before me. You must not have any other God but me. Commandment number 2. You must not take for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the 3rd and 4th generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. So these first two commandments go hand in hand. Don't worship any other God but me, and don't worship any other idols. So idols were these handmade objects, often carved of stone or wood or some other precious metals, often like silver or gold or bronze, that people would worship in the ancient world that represented their gods. And this was especially important for the Hebrew people to understand because they were coming out of Egypt, a culture that worshiped a multitude of gods themselves, and they were getting ready to enter a new land where they were going to be surrounded by neighbors who did the same thing. They worshiped these physical representations of their gods, whereas the Hebrew God is invisible and pervasive, right? So these two commands make it clear that our God is the only God they are to worship, and therefore don't even give any of these idols any of your attention. And for us in our modern scientific era, we're like, yeah, duh. Duh, like why would these people think that bowing down to these carved pieces of wood or stone or golden calves or any of these inanimate objects, lifeless objects, how could those possibly do anything? Right? Like didn't they know these were just inanimate objects? Didn't they know that? Were they stupid? That it was just all a mere coincidence that when they did worship them, then the weather patterns would magically change for them? Or when they worshiped these idols, that then they would be granted prosperity or fertility? Surely it was a coincidence. Well, to us, yes, this makes complete sense in our individualistic, postmodern Western world. But here's the thing about the ancient world. They were not stupid. They knew how the world worked. And they only did these things if they worked. And so what that means is that the reason people worshiped idols is because they worked. And they continue to work. In fact, you even go to a lot of other cultures around the world, the worshiping of idols work because these idols were demon-possessed. Okay? Just as we worship the one true God, there are also spiritual adversaries that are fighting against him, trying to corrupt his good creation. And in the ancient world, they often manifested through the worship of these idols, these other deities, which truly they were the forces that are opposing God. Just as the Hebrews and ourselves, right, worship this one true God, Satan and his demonic forces show up in these ways. And the way of how these idols worked is that when you worshiped an idol, they promised abundant rewards for really minimal sacrifice at first. So if an idol or a certain god demanded you sacrifice a little bit of wheat here or a little bit of your livestock there, then you were granted all this rain or you were granted prosperity. You name your benefit of promise, it will give it to you just for a little bit of a sacrifice. And then they worked. Again, which is why these idols were so attractive. This is why God's people consistently fought for them, because they granted immediate supply of their demand. They worked. However, here's the catch. These idols, powered by these demons, though they worked and were enchanted with magic, they would gradually increase the sacrifice they ask of you and start to decrease the reward that they promised you. So then, in order for you to get that weather pattern you need again, you need to give up a little bit more wheat than last time. Oh, you want financial prosperity again? Well, I need half of your livestock now. Oh, you want to have more children? I'm going to need some of your blood for that. And once you get entangled with the demonic power of these idols, they could unleash havoc on your life that if you don't give them what they wanted with their growing demands over you, then it is going to cause a lot of problems. And these sacrifices that these idols required of you would increase until they demanded the most important and prized possession of your life, and it was your children. And that is particularly what is so detestable to God about the worship of idols, is because of the sacrifice it ultimately demanded of your children. And in fact, here's a story of where this took place. So if you turn over to 2 Kings chapter 3, I believe it's 2 Kings. Yeah, 2 Kings chapter 3. One of Israel's neighboring nations was called the Moabites. It's from the nation of Moab. And when King Joram began to rule over the kingdom of Israel, King Mesha of Moab rebelled against them. They didn't want anything to do with the nation of Israel anymore. So King Joram rallied the nation of Israel and the southern nation of Judah and the nation of Edom to go and fight against the Moabites because of this rebellion that they casted against them. 3 armies against this one Moab army. Chances were pretty good that we know who's going to come out on top after this story. And so King Joram of Israel inquires Isaiah the prophet especially to see what God thought about their efforts to defeat this nation. And God himself says that they will be granted victory over the Moabites. You will win. It's a pretty exciting, confident response from God. So how could they not chase this? Well, this is exactly what happens. The three armies ransack Moab. They destroy these cities. They take and plunder and defeat their armies until there are only 700 Moabites left. 700 swordsmen. And just when the three armies were going to deal their final blow, they got the Moabites cornered. Here's what it says in 2 Kings 3, verse 27. This is really particular. Then the king of Moab took his oldest son, who would have been the next king, and sacrificed him as a burnt offering on the wall. So there was great anger against Israel, and the Israelites withdrew and returned to their own land. Whoa! So some scholars interpret this passage that in a final, desperate attempt to reign victorious over these three armies, the king of Moab took his own son, sacrificed him to the Moab god, the idol, and the spiritual force that was unleashed from that was so great that it actually pushed back against God's prophecy that they would be victorious. That there was some spiritual warfare that occurred here, and the three armies withdrew because those spiritual forces were satisfied. That's wild, isn't it? Idols weren't just these objects that people fixated their attention on and obsessed over. While that's certainly a part of it, as what we think about when you hear like churches talk about modern idolatry, it literally enslaved them to evil forces of the unseen world that, yes, granted them their wishes, but also wreaked havoc on their lives. And so then when you look through the rest of the Old Testament especially, there are so many passages that just so vehemently condemn God's people from worshiping idols because they take over your life, they destroy your humanity, they ruin your family, and you become enslaved to their wishes. Here's just a couple of those passages. In Isaiah 57, God condemns Israel for their idol worship when he says, "You worship your idols with great passion beneath the oaks and under every green tree. You sacrifice your children down in the valleys." See that? You sacrifice your children down in the valleys among the jagged rocks and the cliffs. Your gods are the smooth stones in the valleys. You worship them with liquid offerings and grain offerings. They, not I, are your inheritance. Do you think all this makes me happy? You've committed adultery on every high mountain, and there you have worshipped idols and have been unfaithful to me. Or if you hop over to Ezekiel chapter 16, God gives this beautiful illustration of how God comes in, he rescues Israel, he makes her his bride. It's a beautiful depiction of the relationship between God and his people. But God then compares his people's insistence on worshiping these other gods and these idols as if they were prostitutes who craved intimacy with every other person except him. And the pinnacle of his critique occurs here in verses 20 through 24 when he says, "Then you took your sons and daughters, the children you had born to me, and sacrificed them to your gods. Was your prostitution not enough? Must you also slaughter my children by sacrificing them to idols? In all your years of adultery and detestable sin, you have not once remembered the days long ago when you lay naked in a field kicking about your own blood. What sorrow awaits you, says the sovereign Lord. In addition to all your other wickedness, you built a pagan shrine and put altars to idols in every town square." Lastly, Psalm 135, verses 15 through 18, condemns just the faultiness of idolatry when it says, "The idols of the nations are merely things of silver and gold, shaped by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, and mouths but cannot breathe. And those who make idols are just like them, as are all who trust in them." So that's what they do. They take over your life, they demand the sacrifice of your children, and they destroy your families. Now, although we don't worship demonized idols made of wood and stone and silver and gold, perhaps we do worship demonized idols made of glass and aluminum and lithium silicon. More and more studies are finding just how these little devices that are so central to our lives are tearing us apart. They are great for us, but they're also doing something to us. Let's talk about a couple of those things. And the first is phone addiction. Okay? We are addicted to these things. How's your screen time report looking lately? Has it come out yet? It normally comes out on Sunday mornings. Yep, here it is. My screen time report already there. The average U.S. citizen spends 7 hours of screen time per day. Teenagers between the ages of 13 and 18 spend an average of 8 hours of screen time per day, when it was 3 hours in the 90s, when all we had was TVs and VHS tapes. Bring back the good old days, you know? You have to rewind them just to be able to play them. Oh man, crazy. Here's why this matters. Right now, we're living in something called the attention economy. And what that means is that the longer companies and brands can hold our attention, the more money they make. And so developers of apps like Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Snapchat and Tinder, all these apps that we use on a daily, regular basis, intentionally design their apps in such a way that makes them addictive and exploits our psychology. So we keep coming back to them and we keep spending countless hours on them, all while we're subtly being exposed to all these little advertisements just over here in the corner there, or you scroll right past them, and is this right there? And you linger on these apps, and all these companies are making money off it. Tristan Harris, who once worked as an ethicist for Google, noted how the apps and devices designed by Google and Apple and Facebook are ultimately trying to hijack our psychology and basically want to limit our attention spans for anything else beyond these screens. So here's what he says goes on in the minds of these app developers and businesses when they're putting these things together. Okay? Check this out. In an attention economy, there's only so much attention, and the advertising business model always wants more. So it becomes a race to the bottom of the brainstem. It starts small. First, to get your attention, I add slot machine pull to refresh rewards, which create little addictions. I remove stopping cues for infinite scroll, so your mind forgets when to do something else. But that's not enough. As attention gets more competitive, we have to crawl deeper down the brainstem to your identity and get you addicted to getting attention from other people. By adding the number of followers and likes, technology hacks our social validation, and now people are obsessed with the constant feedback they get from others. This helped fuel a mental health crisis for teenagers. So we get these devices, which again are truly amazing things that can do so much for us, but they are taking our minds and our bodies and our attention to the point where we legitimately can't even imagine a life without them. These companies do not care about your well-being if they can make profit off of you. So they design them in a way that wreaks havoc on us. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, when ancient gods asked for the sacrifice, right? They ask for a sacrifice in order to get some form of a benefit, right? But over time, it asks and calls for more and more sacrifice or even less and less of a reward. The phones that we have in our pockets promise us greater connection than ever before, right? But the sacrifice is a loss of true connection. It promises greater connection than ever before, but we are losing true connection until you are addicted and anxious and depressed and alone. But you got all your likes on Instagram. So because of that, because of phone addiction, it is fueling our mental health crisis that we're seeing in our culture right now, especially amongst teens and young adults. In his book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, he talks about how the rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide all went up for teens and young adults after the smartphone became largely adopted in the U.S. between 2010 and 2015. Often some people said that, it's more correlated than it is causation or whatever, but more and more studies are coming out and saying, no, it is these things that are causing our mental health epidemic right now. Tell me how that does not parallel with demonic idols literally demanding the lives of children. like what we see with the Moabite king and his own son. Studies have shown that since wide adoption of these devices, excessive screen time yields, obviously less time spent face-to-face with friends, but that also brings about excessive sleep deprivation, which can increase depression, anxiety, irritability, cognitive deficits, lower grades, and even more accidents. Excessive screen time makes it impossible to focus deeply on certain tasks. It fragments your attention spans, and therefore people suffer from that attention fragmentation. And again, app developers design their apps to be addictive and hijack our dopamine receptors, which means, dopamine brings about pleasure, but it doesn't bring about the sense of satisfaction. So have you ever just gotten off an hour-long scrolling span and you finally turn your phone off and you're like, wow, I feel so good about myself? I'm so glad I did that, you know? No, it's more often for me, I'm like, gosh, why did I do that? I had so many other things I could have done. I've just been sucked in. They got me, you know? They got me. These idols of glass, aluminum, and silicon promise us connection and validation and entertainment and pleasure as long as we give them our eyes, our attention, our money, our reverence. But again, they just leave us more isolated, fragmented, sleep-deprived, and depressed. Not to mention how these devices, they're just not wreaking havoc on our brains, they're destroying our families as well. Kids need the attention of their parents. Literally, like brain development occurs in infants, in newborns, in toddlers when they can latch onto the attention of their parents. It's massive. It's massive. But Facebook also happens to be more appealing sometimes in those moments. Or because we got to finish a quick text. We got to clear out that email. Several months ago, Casey and I were on a date night to Olive Garden, her favorites, one of our favorites, down in Sioux City. And typically when we go on date nights, I try to be really intentional to put my phone and just lock it in my car so I can be all focused. Casey's way more disciplined than I am. So here we are, we're sitting in the lobby waiting for us to be seated, and there's this family there, husband and wife and two of their kids, two sons, where the whole time they were out there, they had their headphones on, playing on their tablets. Like, okay, that seems a little crazy, but whatever. You know, we get seated and we have a great meal or whatever, and we start walking out, and we pass the same family sitting down eating their meal, and their kids still have their headphones on, still on their tablets, while they're eating. Man, and perhaps the idol of screen time maybe has promised them easier parenting, but what they're actually maybe signing up for is lazier parenting that could produce, who knows what this is producing in kids, right? And it was so easy for me to cast judgment in that moment. Wow, I'm so glad I'm more disciplined with my screen time. But then I remember all the times when Adeline, who's not even 2 years old, when she's sitting on my lap, literally would pull my phone down from my face to look at me. Or I'm holding my phone like this, and while I'm holding her, and she just swings herself around to try to get my attention. Or there are times when I'm sitting in the bathroom while Amelia's getting potty trained and all of this stuff, or, you know, she wants to play who knows how long of a game. She actually sits on the toilet for 20 minutes because she's a toddler, not because we're scrolling on these things, right? But then there's been several moments where I'm looking at something, and I'm probably reading macrumors.com or something, and she tells me, Daddy, put your phone away. Put your phone away. My 3-year-old's telling me this. Never before has a device brought the world so close together and yet pushed the living room so far apart. Man, like how are we supposed to foster good conversation and community with our own families when screens are holding our attention instead? Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that these idols in our pockets demand our attention at the expense of our own kids. And all of this, man, it's not just breaking apart our families, it's breaking apart society too. It's ripping society apart. One of the ways, again, that these devices work is to lack onto our attention, and there's these algorithms that are they're curating content specifically for you. And we talked a little bit about this last week. It's giving you content that affirms your identities and affirms your beliefs. It's giving you all of these same things. You know, oh, you like all these funny memes about working out? Here's even more of those, you know. Like, and that's what's so fun about it. I mean, we get into those, which is really great. But it also intentionally gives you posts that are going to make you angry. Because it turns out the posts that get our most attention are the ones that make us boil up inside. I guarantee you, the post that you're reading word for word is when your Uncle Bob posts another ridiculous political statement. So you read every single word, and then you get into the comment streams, and you're seeing them all, you know, all of his own people in his echo chamber affirming everything that he believes, and it drives you crazy. So what do? You get on there, and you start writing your 500-paragraph long response, you know, that's perfect in its execution, right? You don't spend any other time writing comments in response to anybody except this one that makes you angry, right? And you're constantly going back and forth, and you know what the whole time is right there on the side of your screen? An advertisement to Ace Hardware. companies are making money off of our division. So it's giving you content that makes you happy and feel good and all the things you love, but it's also giving you content that drives you up a wall and makes you angry because it locks on to your attention. Our fight or flight mode increases, it gets turned on, and that's why this is happening. Tell me, I don't think it's a coincidence that our political seasons have gotten more divisive and more heated since the smartphone has been adopted between 2010 and 2015. I feel like 2012 was our last, most civil presidential election. And it's just gotten crazy since then. It's because these things just further proliferate and exacerbate divides. Are we convinced yet? Everyone's like, I don't even want this thing anymore, it's just, what do we do? Because these things are incredible tools that are so fun. I'm not even saying completely get off social media entirely, because there's some really awesome, fun things that you can do, but it has to have its limits. It has to have its limits, or else it is just so easy for it to take over our lives. So what do we do in response? We got to learn how to fight back. We got to learn how to fight back against these demons in our pockets so that they can be something that serves us and benefits our well-being rather than us serving them to sacrifice our well-being. So here's 2 steps that I want to suggest for us to take in fighting it back against these demons in our pockets. And the first is to decrease screen time. Decrease screen time. In Deuteronomy, Moses gives a series of speeches to a new generation of Israelites just before they finally enter the Promised Land. And of course, the warning against idolatry comes back up, you could imagine. And God insists that they're only to worship him because, according to chapter 12, verse 31, the idols and gods of these other nations perform detestable acts that the Lord hates, including burning their sons and daughters as sacrifices. You see that come up again and again and again. So in Deuteronomy chapter 13, God gives them some scenarios of what they are to do if these surrounding nations tempt them with their idol worship. Okay? Here's what God says and tells them. Suppose there are prophets among you, or those who dream dreams about the future, and they promise you signs or miracles, and the predicted signs or miracles occur. If they then say, "Come, let us worship other gods, gods you have not known before," do not listen to them. The Lord your God is testing you to see if you truly love him with all your heart and soul. Serve only the Lord your God and fear him alone. Obey his commands, listen to his voice, and cling to him. The false prophets or visionaries who try to lead you astray must be put to death, for they encourage rebellion against the Lord your God, who redeemed you from slavery and brought you out of the land of Egypt. Since they try to lead you astray from the way of the Lord your God commanded you to live, you must put them to death. In this way you will purge the evil from among you. Well, that escalated quickly, didn't it? I mean, is this passage saying that we should go over to Apple's and Google's and Meta's headquarters and set their buildings on fire and murder them all? And Ledger's, yeah! Anarchy! No, that's not what this is saying. It's not what this is saying. But what it should tell us to do, what we can do, is to kill the ploy of big tech. Let's not kill them, but let's kill the ploy. Let's kill the ploy. What God is doing here is setting very clear boundaries of how to avoid this type of evil at all costs, especially if it diverts us into wayward living and distracts us from worshiping God fully. We got to purge it from us. So we need to put literal boundaries on these things, or else, again, it's going to overcome us and wreak havoc on our life. So here are just some really practical tips to do that. You can search the internet for more, which is just incredibly ironic, of how you can do that. But here's just a couple. First, don't keep your work email on your phone. So then you're never tempted at 8 o'clock p.m. while you're sitting on the toilet to check your emails. You don't need to see those right then, Helps you keep it to your desktop. Number 2, put your phone to bed at a certain time each night. Literally turn it off and get an actual alarm clock. They do still make those. Then you're less tempted to scroll for hours on end right before you go to sleep. Literally, lock your phones up in a box for family meals. So they make phone lockers. So you have to put in a code for it? Yeah, they're awesome. Reserve social media to your laptop browser. I've done this for a long time because then you can only pull out your laptop at certain points, It's a lot less accessible when you don't have them on your phone, which helps eliminate that distraction. So you can still participate, but not have it on your person all the time. Or in fact, you can just get rid of social media apps as a whole. Just get rid of them as a whole. You can actually enable app limits on your devices and follow them. Those are game changers. If you only want 5 minutes here, then it pulls up blockers. You can do that on your phones. And even if you want to go the next step, you can have a friend hold you accountable, reduce your screen time together, and set passcodes for each other. Because then you can't change it unless they access it, right? Hardcore. I mean, the list can go on and on, but here's why this is important, and I have to make a really bold statement. We talk a lot about mental health these days, especially for young adults. Like, it is at epidemic levels right now. But according to all of these stats, if you want better mental health, you got to get off social media. Like, if you haven't truly tried that, then can we even have the right to complain about the status of our mental health? Like, we have to start with that. We have to start with that. If you're spending excessive time on it, let's put those limits on it and see what it does. Studies show like even just 3 weeks off of being off it improves mental health dramatically. It's insane. So we need to keep that in mind. Study after study shows that mood and happiness increase when screen time and social media use decrease. Study after study shows that. So that's the first step. We need to decrease screen time. But then the second step is to increase face time. Notice there's a space there. There's a space between the word FaceTime because we need to spend more time face-to-face with others. There's this itty-bitty little tiny book in Scripture called 3 John. I doubt any of us have read it. It's really small. It's only 15 verses, but it's this short letter that the Apostle John writes to another church leader and his friend named Gaius. And in this letter, John's praising Gaius for all of the hospitality he's providing for traveling teachers of the gospel, and he gives a couple of other warnings and encouragement along the way. But I love what he writes at the end of the letter in verses 13 and 14 when John says, I have much more to say to you, but I don't want to write it with pen and ink, for I hope to see you soon, and then we will talk face to face. Perhaps there's no greater verse that cuts to the heart of what we need right now in our digital age. We have so much we want to say to people, but we do want to write it with pen and ink, or rather, text and emojis and pixels. Through iMessage and text message and email and Slack and Instagram DMs, you name it. So I think we would be way better off to put the phones down and say, I hope to see you soon so we can talk face to face. Now, granted, FaceTime and all these other video call platforms are amazing, especially for long distance relationships. Like, I think Gaius and John would love to have the technology that we do today. That's amazing. But phone calls and FaceTime do not replace the power of what happens in just face-to-face connection. You know why you feel exhausted after a 2-hour-long Zoom call? It's because your brains aren't meant to socialize over digital means like that. It's working double time, trying to make sense of it, of how to interact with a screen. This is a person, but it's not. I see myself at the same time. You're not supposed to see yourself while you're also having these calls. It's working on double time. Just because we can connect through digital means does not mean it is a quality connection. So here's what this can look like. Don't text your roommate all the problems you have with them. Text them in person. I've heard of stories of literally roommates sitting side by side on a couch just having beef with each other, and they text their responses to each other. They get it figured out, and they turn and they say, cool. And then they just continue on, Like, talk to them face to face. Talk to them face to face. Don't think your emojis will communicate how you truly feel in your email. Go to the office and tell them in person. You might think an audio message is better than a text message, but why not look into their eyes and see their facial expressions as you talk with them? We need to be present with our friends, with our spouse, with our kids. Put the phone away, leave it in the car for social gatherings. Engage with people in line at Starbucks. Keep the AirPods out when you go to the grocery store so you can interact with people, right? Order your food in person instead of the app. Go through the grocery store and don't just opt for curbside pickup. Yes, all these technological advances save us time, but they rob us of face time. Isolating ourselves in the name of technological progression is humanity's regression. Take a picture of that. Text it to yourself. I don't know. Isolating ourselves in the name of technological progression is humanity's regression. Convenience isn't always constructive. So if we want to remain human and live a life that flourishes, we need something that technology will never be able to replicate. And it is face-to-face interaction with our friends, with our families, with our kids. It can never replace that. It can never replace that.